Good afternoon, everybody. We have a speaker today who traveled a long way, both in miles and in degrees centigrade, from Darwin to Melbourne to speak to us today. She's Sharon Bell, a professor. Sharon Bell is the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Charles Darwin University and a professorial fellow at the L.H. Martin Institute at the University of Melbourne. She's Emeritus Professor at the University of Wollongong. She was co-convener of Universities Australia Executive Women from 2005 to 2008. Her background is as a senior academic administrator, a documentary filmmaker, and anthropologist. And she's been a good friend, and I've met members of her very interesting family. You might know the movie Sunday Too Far Away, which was directed by her husband. Her son makes the best rosé I think I know. He's in the Hunter Valley, a Gun Dog Winery, and another son who's a PhD journalist in Darwin also. She holds a PhD from the University of Sydney in the discipline of anthropology. And over the past decade, she's conducted research on gender equity in the Australian Academy and has authored influential reports such as the Women in Science Australia, Maximizing Productivity, Diversity and Innovation. That was published in 2009. And with Professor Lynn Yates, she from the University of Melbourne, just finished a major project to CI on an ARC linkage grant called Women in the Scientific Research Workforce, Identifying and Sustaining the Diversity Advantage. I met Sharon in 2009 when she was an important member of our then early infancy stages of our Gender Equity Committee, and she's remained, even from Darwin, a valued advisor from afar, and has provided lots of mature and reasoned guidance for us. And you'll see, based on the depth of her understanding of our culture and our scientific society in this country, she speaks with great authority. So I look forward, she's going to tell us today about our culture, and as ourselves as professional scientists, in her science research marathon talk.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for those kind words of welcome, and thank you very much to colleagues at WEHI for inviting me to share some ideas with you today. This seminar came about through an exchange in June in the wake of Tim Hunt's, what are now widely publicised and shared comments about the difficulties of working with women. The most prominent of which is, of course, that they're distractingly sexy. So whilst the seminar was inspired by Tim's comments, I'm really keen to move beyond the responsive and the rhetoric, to contextualise these comments in terms of what we know about gender and science research careers. I was tempted to ask, and you can probably all see yourselves a little bit better than me, but I was going to start and finish by asking for you to show a hand as to who in the room sees themselves as distractingly sexy. So I have a sense of the audience with whom I'm dealing. But we will come back to that. We will give you an opportunity. The structure of the discussion will be, first of all, around the ARC research project results, which Lynn Yates from the University of Melbourne and I have recently completed with our wonderful industry partners, Biomedical Research Victoria, RACI, and Science and Technology Australia. And I really wanted to take the opportunity, as I do at every such occasion, to really thank our industry partners because they have just been fantastic. So if anyone's actually nervous about ARC linkage grants and managing partners, just make sure you choose the right ones. It's been really terrific to work with them, and we will continue to do so. I'll then look at how this research has shaped the concept of a science research marathon and where Tim Hunt's remarks fit into our understanding, and there will be time for questions at the end. But if you do have a burning question while I'm speaking or you want to violently object to something I say, please don't hesitate. Perhaps it shouldn't be, it is a very contested field. And one of the things about coming from Darwin, where I'm working currently, is that you're probably aware that we in the Northern Territory like to think of ourselves as different. we like to actually test the waters with ideas, with outspoken comments, and with basically saying the world can look very different from the top of Australia to the way the world looks from Melbourne. So the inspiration for the research project, for the ARC project, was three elements. Firstly, and being a woman, I will say it was absolutely good luck. The Federation of Australian Science and Technology Associations in 2008 asked me, quite out of the blue it seemed, to consider writing a report on women in science in Australia. That was, it turned out to be, I think, a landmark report. It was based on a very, very, very small resource. I don't mind sharing with you. We had a sum of $30,000 for that report, and that meant that we couldn't actually engage in anything but drawing on secondary sources. So it was completely drawing on secondary sources. So the germ of what if we had a slightly bigger resource and we had the time and the ability to draw on a wider range of resources and generate primary resources was sown at that time. The second inspiration was the wonderful work of Lottie Balin and her colleagues at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who you are undoubtedly aware really began work in the 1990s on identifying what were the issues around women in science. And one of the key conclusions that that group that started in the 90s and has continued to work is that discrimination against women does continue to exist, but it is subtle, it is pervasive, and stems from largely unconscious ways of thinking that have been socialised into all of us, men and women alike. Now, in that context, I'm going to actually, just to make sure that you all remain engaged, for some of you who don't like the words I'm speaking, we're going to move to also have a series of images that have been generated through the Distractingly Sexy campaign on Twitter and also other social media, Instagram, and a number of other sources. One of the things about these images that is so relevant to Lottie Balin's comments is that what people record is their own context and their own experience, and just how often that doesn't actually sit with perhaps the views of the majority or the views of the mainstream. Balin observes that the current really subtle discrimination that women experience makes the situation better than it was when they first started their work in the 1990s, in that blatant sexual assault and blatant inequalities tend not to occur when once they did, and we all need to be thankful for that. But the subtle forms of discrimination are really demoralising, and they're often very difficult to identify and to address. The women with whom Lottie Balin worked had one thing in common. They were senior women who, as individuals, started with the premise that they had been successful in their careers. They didn't really think there was a problem until they got together and began to talk about their common experience and actually share their experience of being part of the science research workforce. Of course, this work, this early work from MIT, has fostered a plethora of studies and a great body of research, and the National Academy of Sciences in the United States has been particularly active in this space. One of the other works that inspired our ARC research was a fairly recent report, or 2010 report, on critical career transitions in the careers of science, engineering and maths faculty by the National Research Council of the United States. There was much in that report which was similar to the findings of our FAST report. They identified a postdoctoral tipping point to tenure and tenure track positions. They identified the fact that female faculty experienced isolation. that men publish more than women, that women are most likely to be underrepresented in the fields in which they accounted for the largest share of the faculty in biology and chemistry. So it was due to this report that we decided to focus on biology and chemistry. But there was a really significant omission in this study which we wanted to correct, and that is that there were some findings that we weren't sure resonated with people's experiences. For instance, the high success rate of females when they applied for positions, the fact that equality was actually achieved in teaching, research and service, and that there was no significant gender disparity at promotion to full professor. We actually, when we looked at this study closely, found that there was a significant omission, as I said, and that was that the study excluded the very people who weren't succeeding. It excluded PhDs who had never applied for academic positions, so people at the end of their PhD who could not see a future for themselves as research scientists. They excluded female faculty who'd left the academy at various points in their academic careers, and they excluded non-tenure track part-time faculty. And again, women make up the majority of these people. I don't know whether you're aware, but there's been a recent study in Australia of Australian universities and their workforce, and it's done by someone who's now working in the research office at the University of Melbourne, and she found that using UniSuper data, you can identify how many casual workers there are in the workforce by their differential contributions to superannuation fund and what their gender identity is. And they found that in Australia, there are more casual workers than there are full-time continuing workers or fixed-term workers. There are 67,000 casual workers in our university system now, and over 60% of those people are women. So we've got a very, very significant and disguised series of work practices and issues around our workforce. And some of those issues are very much people in research careers as well as in teaching and learning. And we do see similar situations in the science research workforce. So we decided that we'd conduct a big survey to address some of the issues that were omissions in previous studies. We received, disarmingly sexy, we received just under 1,300 usable responses to the survey, and thank you to those here who responded. We were keen to capture male and female scientists' responses, and this goal was achieved with 52% of respondents being female and 48% being male. And we were also keen to capture, using a snowball technique, those who'd left the science research workforce. So what did we find out? We found that postgraduates in the fields of biological sciences and chemistry, our two fields of focus, are part of an exceptionally highly qualified and rapidly growing population in Australia. Most survey respondents were under 40 years of age, and most male respondents were over 40 years of age. And this exactly mirrors the census data, which we cross-referenced. Women were overrepresented amongst those qualified and working in biological sciences, and men were overrepresented amongst those qualified and working in chemical sciences. Less than half the respondents who identified as currently in the research workforce were employed in full-time continuing positions, less than half, with older men dominating this employment category. We thought, it was always our assumption, and I don't think it's been proven wrong, that we are dealing with a population that is amongst the best and brightest in our country. So why is it that this exceptionally qualified population enjoys, or indeed suffers, such deploring working conditions? The survey data confirms that the majority of the survey population was motivated to pursue a career in science, primarily by passion. Passion, not for Tim Hunt, but passion for their field of study and the prospect of intellectually stimulating work. and there were no significant differences in that between men and women. Most people commencing their doctoral studies in the field of biological and chemical sciences saw the career as a research scientist as ideal. However, we found that there was a significant and growing disjunction between that ideal, that career aspiration, and employment opportunities for emerging doctoral graduates and early career researchers. And I recall one of the earliest surveys we did here at WEHI, which looked at organisational culture. We found that the population of PhD students, of postdoc students, was in fact the population that had the most significant questions to ask about the organisational culture and opportunities within the organisation. So we then asked the question, well, who is it who does succeed in what is a very demanding Australian research environment? The survey data confirmed the well-documented fact that, and this won't be a surprise to anyone in the room, science research requires high levels of commitment from those working full-time and also those working part-time, and long hours. And this was particularly so in biological sciences. But for most respondents, the passion for the field of study, intellectual stimulation, and autonomy and control were really highly valued, as was the opportunity to contribute to new knowledge. So people accommodated all sorts of demands on their lives and the impact on those around them because they were pursuing their passion. These responses, we suggest, argue that the high levels of commitment and motivation of research science is an important contributor to the cultures of long hours. I don't think you have to Bundy on and Bundy off here. And so the culture of long hours is actually partly driven by scientists themselves who realise what it takes to succeed. And without putting in the time, the hours, without the commitment, it is actually impossible to succeed in the current science paradigm. Importantly, an intensive period of research productivity in the postdoctoral career stage, typically a stage of family formation for men and women, is key to establishing a career as an independent researcher. And this is a clear tipping point for women. And time out of the workforce at that critical stage dramatically affects women more than it does men. There were really interesting questions around people's perceptions of themselves, whether they considered themselves to be the best and brightest, and how this played out in terms of the dynamics of their career. More women displayed significant confidence in their ability and identified as the best and brightest at the undergraduate level of their career, but at all later career stages and age, employment became more important than significant. And women, much more than men, declined in terms of their confidence throughout their careers. So this may be a reflection of this emerging disjunction in career opportunities for younger generations, particularly in the higher education and research sector, and this is particularly the case in biological sciences. Related factors that have influenced career success reinforce a strong pattern of differentiated gender achievement. A higher proportion of men indicated that they progressed more quickly than those with whom they'd completed their studies, and a higher proportion of women indicated that they'd progressed more slowly than those with whom they'd completed their studies. 3 times as many women as men had taken long periods of leave. We asked, had you had leave over 6 months of time, and believed that that time out of their career for family reasons was a major explanation for slower career progress. It's not surprising then that more men than women reported higher levels of confidence in their ability as helpful to their career advancement. We also looked at people who'd left the research workforce, and we found that there was, again, a gendered pattern. Overall, career changes seem to be influenced by a lack of prospects in research rather than a lack of continuing interest in a research career. And that indicates to us that the research workforce is losing scientists who would prefer to remain in research roles. And I think that is one of the really key questions that we need to be looking at as a sector. And we also found, not surprisingly, that the terms of employment on a fixed-term, casual or self-employed basis, had the strongest negative association with job satisfaction, even after controlling for other influential characteristics in regression analysis. Among the important propositions, however, that this research tested were to what degree were respondents' knowledge and skills fully utilised, and whether those who had left the research workforce quit science, as is often assumed. And the American literature in particular is full of references to women quitting science. We found that, in fact, our respondents didn't quit science. They moved into a broader range of professions and sectors, but a very large proportion reported that they continued to use their scientific knowledge and skills at a high level, but they are no longer recorded as part of the science research workforce. The respondents currently working in a research role, not surprisingly, reported high levels of knowledge and skills utilisation. But we also found that there was very little difference in the results by gender, but women, particularly in the postdoctoral phase, transitioned to a wider range of occupations than men. So we're actually assuming that what women look for in that critical postdoctoral phase is a range of occupations which are more accommodating than the science research roles. And so they spread out. Some of the literature calls this organic branching, but in fact, it means that when people enter these wider range of careers and occupations, in terms of all the census data, the ABS data, they are actually lost in terms of recognition of their continuing membership or contribution to science. We also found from focus groups, which we conducted after the survey, that there was really strong evidence of people no longer in scientific research roles continuing their engagement with science, and examples of individuals who have gone to great lengths to re-engage or re-enter the science research workforce. I remember one of our focus group participants, who was a very enthusiastic young person, had begun with great passion to explore a research career, had gone down that path of the third postdoc, thinking, how can I live? How can I survive? What is my future? And so had chosen to return to study medicine, leaving biological science research, because, as they said, well, at least then I take home a six-figure salary. However, that person expressed really strong intent that hopefully, after being a doctor for a while, a medical practitioner, that they would return to the science research workforce. In the biological sciences, we also found differences in terms of what actually underpins people's occupations. About 25% of male respondents had their own grant, so they had funding that underpinned their research in biological sciences, and about 20% of female respondents were in that space. A further 48% of male respondents were directly employed on continuing positions, compared to only 28% of women. These responses did not include people not currently in a research role, and they may be a reflection of changing circumstances when you remember the differences between the age cohorts of men and women. And we can't, this is point-in-time data, so we can't actually speculate entirely accurately until we have really robust longitudinal data. Only just over a quarter of the biological sciences sample said they thought they had good job security, and 63% said they disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, "I have good job security." Women were more likely than men to report that they did not have good job security. The final satisfaction question that we asked was whether people felt they had good career and promotion opportunities. And we found that 42% of people in biological sciences, compared to 25% of those in chemical sciences, disagreed or strongly disagreed with that statement. So again, we're seeing very significant differences between these fields. So the sample data paints a picture of a really highly qualified and committed workforce engaged in work that is rewarding but demands long hours, and I suspect that's not a surprise to any of you. Levels of satisfaction are compromised by a disjunction between career aspirations and career opportunities. And this is compounded by fragile conditions of employment reflected in the data on job security and career prospects. When we asked what would make a difference to job satisfaction, about half said job security, and they thought it was the single most important factor. We also asked, when you talk about job security, what would actually make a difference? Because we weren't working in an environment where we felt if we came out with a recommendation that said everyone should be put on continuing on contracts, that there would be any prospect of success. But it was the extension, the removal of one-year contracts, which are becoming ubiquitous for a range of reasons we can talk about after, but one-year contracts which are driven by avoiding industrial relations responsibilities and fear of senior researcher mobility, remove those and create 3 to 5 year contracts for the science research workforce. That would make a significant difference to people's security and also their personal circumstances. I don't know whether that gels with you. The other factor that we looked at again was what makes a difference in terms of assisting people in their roles. We found that informal mentoring was seen as very helpful for about 40% of men and women. In the biological sciences, it's really interesting to note that only about 20% of men and 32% of women felt that their level of confidence in their ability was either a problem or a major problem. That's a fair proportion of the population. A third of the population of women think their confidence in their ability is a problem or a major problem. And we see that in the participation rates in national competitive grant systems, where by and large, not in all categories, but in many categories, we see women succeeding in national competitive grants at the same rates of participation, but we're not seeing the levels of participation. So if people are not feeling confident, they're not being mentored to build that confidence, they're not going to expose themselves in competitive grant schemes. In fact, in relation to the grant-driven culture, it was the fact that women felt that their confidence compromised their ability to apply for grants, but only 7% of male colleagues said that that was the issue for them. So, in summary, we felt that there were really significant patterns of gender difference coming out, but as Lotte Balin had reminded us, these were not difference which we would normally label overt gender discrimination. Gender differences existed in hours of work, in contract of employment, in the way people's salaries were funded. Men were in a much more stable situation. They had much more access to funding, and we need to, however, modify that, the assumptions around that by saying they are also primarily of an older generation of people where the opportunities in the sector may have been framed differently. Most respondents also considered being geographically mobile as a critical part of being successful. So, as I said, the data portray a highly qualified and committed workforce engaged in long hours, but is rewarding. The focus group also confirmed the evidence of this survey and also pointed us to a relative lack of understanding amongst postgraduates of the actual nature of the science research workforce, the actual nature of conditions of employment, partly because the PhD process itself is so competitive. And it also tends to have a very inward focus. When you're doing a PhD, you're absolutely focused on the science, on the lab in which you're engaged, and ensuring that you get good outcomes from that. And the National Research Student Survey of 2010, on which we drew, indicates really clearly that people have very little understanding of employment prospects at the beginning of a PhD, but by the end of that PhD, those perceptions have shifted, and they've actually begun to discover that the world they thought would exist for them when they completed a PhD is really quite different to one they imagined when they started. And of course, institutions have a great interest in continuing to encourage and engage as many students as they can possibly afford in the PhD, not to produce the outcomes for the individual in terms of their career prospects, but to drive the research, the science research engine, because we all know, and there's quite a lot of data now, that shows that PhD students are absolutely critical to the scientific enterprise. Interestingly, there's some data coming out of the United States at the moment that indicates that a great deal of the, or a significant proportion of the science generated in the United States before the global financial crisis and 9/11 was generated by PhD students who'd come from the Middle East and from India in particular to study in the United States. And those numbers have fallen away dramatically, and we're beginning to see change patterns in certain disciplinary fields around that productivity. So that relationship of the PhD student to drive research, and then how that actually does develop opportunities for the individual and how it doesn't, or how it develops opportunities for only a small portion of individuals, is in fact a critical question. As I said, the negotiation of the mid-career phase is also absolutely critical. This is the time when managing careers and personal relationships, mobility and workload, and other pressures accumulate, usually meaning that we understood from the focus groups that someone's career has to give. For women with young children, losing family support due to relocating to pursue their career was a major problem. And as I've said, family formation and the career impacts of periods of leave and part-time work were seen as major issues for women. So one of our recommendations is that we really have to think about how we normalise part-time work in the sector for women and indeed for men who wish to be engaged in parenting and have other career responsibilities. In several focus groups, there were questions frequently asked, is there a right time to have a child? Several participants referred to the value of a supportive wife in a man's scientific career, but other discussions indicated that many younger men are now questioning the unreasonable demands made of scientists and stating their desire to accommodate other priorities in life, particularly in relation to family. But it's not all gloom and doom. The focus groups offered examples of some scientists, both men and women, who had proactively and successfully explored and switched to non-research options and cognate areas of work, and that actually felt that those changes were extremely satisfying changes, and as I said, were using their science knowledge and skills. But there's still very poor translation, and it's obviously something the current government is very interested in, poor translation between opportunities to move between the academia and industry. And this is particularly the case in biological sciences compared to chemical sciences. Chemical sciences, we have a much wider range of those qualified in chemical science employed in industries in a range of organisations from SMEs through to very large organisations, so a very distributed pattern. There's really strong evidence of very poor translation, and it's actually mutual lack of understanding between what highly qualified scientists can provide to industry and what industry, in inverted commas, needs. And we've got a lot of debate going at the moment around the nature of the PhD and whether we should be shaping that to better meet industry needs. In reality, most industries in Australia find it very difficult to actually articulate how they could better develop research and technology capacity within their organisations and how they could productively employ scientists. So participants also, and it's really important to say that this wasn't the case so much in biological sciences, chemical sciences, participants identified organisation and culture and unconscious gender preferences in patterns of appointment, promotion as an opportunity as being important. They were second most important to career satisfaction compared to terms of employment. Our analysis indicates that the reason this was so in biological sciences compared to chemical sciences is that there were much greater issues with employment security. And so what we think is happening is that insecure employment is often overriding the organisational cultural issues that have been so well documented for such a long time. But if we were to address the employment situation, we would actually see many more people concerned about and wanting to address the organisational cultural issues. So those priorities are related, and we can't assume that we can actually address one without addressing the other. So one might ask, what is the relevance of this to Tim Hunt's June remarks? Firstly, I think there is a great deal of relevance in terms of us having a better understanding of the science research career. Tim Hunt's remarks reminded us very, very clearly of something that has been well researched, particularly in the United States, particularly in the field of psychology, that perceptions of women and their abilities are differentially framed. There's a raft of experiments that show that unless there is a capacity to take gender out of the equation, men and women will be differentially assessed. And that relates to a whole range of activities and achievements. And in tandem with that, the way in which women respond to success is differentially assessed compared to male colleagues. There is an element of the culture of research science, which I think we should talk about more, which in fact is a culture which can sometimes be, or often is, extremely competitive. I think increasingly it's often quite ruthless, and scientists are competing against one another. And there's a really high developed concept and nature of bravado, of self-promotion, which is part of what actually goes with success. As a society, we tend to have really high levels of acceptance and tolerance of men's self-promotion and bravado, and we have much lower levels of tolerance of women's self-promotion and bravado. So when you do have a basis for success, the way in which women will be judged if they go out there and try to promote that success is actually really rather different to their male colleagues. Women and men are described as ambitious. When men are described as ambitious, it's often a positive term, or sometimes it's a neutral term. When women are described as ambitious, it's usually a critical term, a negative term. The second point that Tim Hunt's remarks raise is that male leaders, I think, often struggle, and I think this is partly a generational issue. Male leaders often struggle to simply regard their female colleagues as colleagues. And I think that was what was Tim Hunt, struggling to express. So what is played out is Balin's unconscious ways of thinking that have been socialised into all of us. And what he was talking about was some of those unconscious ways of responding. So he was talking about women he saw as wives, potential wives, lovers. I've certainly worked with men at different stages of my career. It might be impossible to believe now, who've seen me as a daughter. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you might be regarded as a bit of a sister, but often there's this struggling to find, how do I actually categorise you and how do I respond to you? Tim's also very much responding to the subtle or not so subtle play of asymmetrical relationships. And one of the things that we've done in our research is, you know, if you want to actually communicate, you always look for a good metaphor. And the metaphor that we finally came up with was the science career marathon. In a marathon, we discovered that through a bit of informal research, these are the qualities for success. Now, isn't it interesting? Passion and commitment, strategy, ability. If we look at the science career marathon, and this is actually data taken from our survey, what is it that leads success? Networks, connections, knowing the right people, good track record, being good at your work, etc., etc. Supportive partners are important. And then you get down to those things at the bottom where, yeah, some things will actually be positive, but then there'll be those things that also tend to actually drag you back. But if we consider the first one, networks, connections, and knowing the right people, that is a very gendered set of activities. So if we go back to Tim's comment that I don't know how to classify women, you know, how do I treat them? They're distractingly sexy. How do women engage in those informal socialising activities if the men around them are responding to them in those stereotypical ways? How do women put in the extra long hours to engage in the socialising in the first place, or the extracurricular professional activities that will lead to the formation of those networks and those supportive structures? And again, how are they accommodated? How are they accommodated when they actually begin to do that in quite an assertive way that's perceived to be inappropriate for women? One of the really important sets of commentary that I saw from the New York Times in relation to Tim's comments was this piece. And what I think, which is stated towards the end, which is really important in this piece, is that what it's actually identifying is that it wasn't the comment itself drawing on stereotypes, but it was the fact that Tim was speaking in the last paragraph as head of an independent laboratory. He was in a position of power in relation to women. And this is where it gets really cruel in many ways, and where even I had times, as I'm sure some of you did, where I felt very sorry for the man. Status and power are powerful attractors. Yes, colleagues do fall in love in the broader sense. Sometimes it's sexual attraction, sometimes it's not. But we do actually fall in love with our culture heroes. And when I first began working with WEHI, one of the things that I read with great interest was Max Charlesworth's Life Amongst the Scientists. And the way in which Macfarlane Burnet is presented as a culture hero told me very much that the population of the organisation at the time was very much in love with their cultural heroes. Status and power are an attractor. They often override the more usual personal characteristics that drive close personal relationships. And everyone in a leadership role, whether that be a Nobel Prize winner, whether it be a director of the institute, whether it be a lab head, needs to actually understand this very powerful dynamic. Because this dynamic is a dynamic that everyone in a leadership role has a responsibility to manage. It is my view that Tim Hunt had a responsibility for actually negotiating relationships in a manner that didn't simply assume that women were falling in love with him. They were possibly attracted to him because of the position that he held, and he should have actually known that asymmetrical relationships play out in a way to make that a very, very powerful and often misleading dynamic. The other way that asymmetrical relationships play out also feeds into one of Tim's comments, and that is the import of commentary from those in positions of power and status. Because praise and criticism are greatly amplified when they come from senior colleagues. So the potential to create tears and the equivalent, but often unseen, hurt or insult, not forgetting the Cure's 1979 observation that boys disguise their true emotional state by laughing, hiding tears in his eyes, because boys don't cry. We all cry, and we all cry inside when our superiors, when those we hold in high regard, when those in status in our disciplines criticise us or fail to support us. The fact that women are socialised to shed tears more frequently than men is irrelevant. We're all crying inside. So Tim now has been left crying, but I think we should actually be thanking him for reminding us that gender does and access does not equal equality, that organisational cultures and the very construction of science is gendered, and also for generating the most wonderful and diverse images of women scientists doing science in their own distractingly sexy way.
Explanation of my life, anyway.
So we've been organising the International Congress for Immunology for 2016, and out of the invited speakers, which are happy invited speakers, the proportion of females who declined their invitation was more than twice the amount of males.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit surprised by that, but maybe I shouldn't have been. But out of the things that you mentioned, what would be the reasons to explain that?
I wouldn't want to respond without knowing more about the population you're actually approaching, but the obvious things are often the circumstances of women, as I said, make mobility quite difficult. Even mobility to attend conferences, women are often juggling, a lot of roles within their own circumstance, their own private circumstances. I think also we do know that if women receive, and we know this from the work of executive search agents, I always tend to think of them as headhunters, but if women receive generic invitations, they tend, relating back to that question of confidence, to think, oh, they're not really serious about inviting me. So often the way in which women need to be targeted is actually in a much more directed way, which from the very beginning states the value of their contribution to such an event. I think also that because of these dynamics, women, there will be women, and I think quite rightly, who will be being really quite strategic in terms of weighing up opportunities that exist and actually making strategic decisions about which are going to be the most valuable and which are not. And I say that particularly in the context that many women in organisations, particularly senior women, have a raft of, if you like, good citizen roles to perform, on committees, working with students closely in ways that are incomparable with male colleagues. So every element of what would be a normal academic career can often be, if you like, something that adds to quite a high level of burden. There's a wonderful study, which I often quote and is readily available by Marion Stevens-Kalsef, a physicist from the University of New South Wales, where she and her colleagues in a very detailed way mapped what was happening in their physics department at University of New South Wales and found that these, again, these very subtle forms of inequality meant that women were actually making decisions on a different basis to men, and juggling quite different pressures. So I don't think you can assume sameness even in professional conferences and that sort of process that underpins those. Some women will also not come if they think they're going to be mixing with a bunch of blokes. So.
Any other questions?
Made a statement, and I presume you meant it in science, that women who were ambitious were perceived to be most well regarded than men who seemed to be ambitious, and I wondered if that was based on fact or
There's quite a lot of studies in the field of psychology which do, in fact, examine these types of attributes and the way they're differentially judged in terms of gender. So I'm going to say there is a factual base that underpins that, but it's not my particular area of research. What I did say was that people use these labels in ways that have these connotations, and that doesn't mean that ambition can't be played out in a manner which colleagues find quite acceptable, or they will tolerate on the part of both men or women. But I'm speaking at a high level of generalisation.
Lisa?
If mentoring and communication styles between superiors of either gender or is causing potentially the issues of women not being able to get mentorship or have good relationship with their superiors, do you know if there's any programs in universities or institutes to actually educate senior members on how to communicate properly to other people, or just even to understand these subtle things of sexism? Because as you said, most sexism occurs both from women and men towards women that none of us actually understand. We're doing it unconsciously.
Yeah,
so is there actually educational programs to help?
There's that's a very good question, and obviously, again, a complex dynamic. There is a great resource which we produced here at the LH Martin Institute at the University of Melbourne called Mentoring for Change, and it's very much designed to address that question. How do we enter mentoring relationships and not simply reproduce the past? So how do we actually enter a mentoring relationship as a vehicle for change and for thinking differently about our roles and the way we construct our roles? How do we ensure that mentors are the learners as well as the coaches, and that the student or the mentee is the person who is actually teaching through a different lens, through a different experience, the more senior person in that relationship. It's a great resource, and I think, obviously these things do take a long period of time, which is why we talk about a science marathon to change organisational cultures. But we were really grappling with the idea of how can we use the very large resource of very experienced senior men and women, but not have those people actually simply reproduce the expectations of their careers in a circumstance which no longer exists. So I do recommend that. And if you just Google Mentoring for Change, it's produced by Universities Australia and LH Martin Institute. It's on the LH Martin Institute website.
Last two questions, Maggie, and then...
Hi Sharon, you're an absolute rock star. I say it every time without fail. But I have a very interesting question around gender equity committees, right? So at institutes, when I meet with them, the first thing they say is, what can we do? So they see the stats, they see it, they want to believe it, they want to change, and then they say, what can we do? So what are the top 3 recommendations you would give to Doug Hilton here at WEHI for organisational change in terms of culture?
So thank you for the question, Maggie. It is one that I'm asked very regularly by people like Doug or vice chancellors, people are really looking for quick answers often. There are some really clear indications of what works and what will actually work, but just as I had the individual marathon, one of the schemas that we've developed is an organisational marathon. The change process is a marathon. You know, we are talking about periods of, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and so a degree of patience around that sort of profound cultural change is necessary. But the big three, leadership from the top. Leadership from the top is absolutely critical, and there's a lot of research again that shows this is essential. One of the issues is that it's much easier for men to provide that leadership than it is for women, because women are seen to be driving an agenda which is that in their own personal interests and of their own personal interests. The second thing is that cultural change in organisations absolutely needs to be contextualised. It's very difficult simply to import solutions from elsewhere. So that demands really intimately knowing your organisation. What is the profile of the organisation? What do you know about the staffing profile, the student profile? What do you know about, and have you got ready access to the data on conditions of employment? It's remarkable how difficult that data is to actually gain. And it's often even difficult to gain data according to normal, ABS classification levels, gender. Age and gender are two really important things to be constantly looking at. So I think it's really critical to develop an evidence base and look at that question of what is the profile of our organisation? How does it differ? Is it a series of microcultures? Do we have parts of the organisation where we see great strength and diversity? Do we have areas that we don't see that? And can we actually identify why that is the case? And then the third thing is to recognise and be quite explicit about the fact that these are questions of value and judgment, and we are all engaged in those processes of judging our colleagues differentially, and we are being judged differentially ourselves. So it is understanding, if you like, the elements of the collective culture rather than the individual, even though each of us experiences the things we experience as an individual, to be able to step back and say, this is happening to me not because I am X, Y, and Z or because I did X, Y, and Z. It's happening to me, or asking the question, is it happening to me because I'm a certain type of person who has a certain identity in this space? I've been in the higher education sector for too many years now, but one of the things about being an anthropologist is that it actually gives you a fantastic set of skills that you can use to generate resilience. And one of the things about being an anthropologist is that you actually, you learn to stand back and watch what is happening in an organisation around you, and sort of stand back and say, well, the natives are behaving badly today, aren't they? And engage in that process of diagnosis and analysis. And of course, this is what you people are so good at, diagnosis and analysis. I mean, that's what you're absolutely trained to do. So I think, and I'm not talking about the WEHI Gender Equity Committee, but one of the things that often surprises me when talking with scientists is that there is an actual tendency to suspend reliance on an evidence base, to suspend reliance on diagnosis and analysis, and move into a highly subjective discourse. And, I think it's actually saying we have a set of skills. You have an extraordinary set of skills to engage in this diagnosis and analysis. Use your scientific skills to do so and advance that cause.
I think that's the longest answer to a question.
Sorry.
And as a result, we're running a little late. You do understand. But I want to thank Sharon for coming all this way.